talk a little bit about dosing of psilocybin and also about microdosing of psilocybin. Now, this is an area that I wouldn't say is controversial, but that there's, how should we say this? There's a lot of loose thinking around this in the non-clinical, non-research communities. But within the clinical and research communities, there's a lot of data that's come out indicating what effective and safe doses, provided all other things are considered safe doses of psilocybin actually are. And here we really can go back to our discussion of psilocybin as quote unquote magic mushrooms or mushrooms. And if one were to translate from the mushroom form of psilocybin to the psilocybin that's actually used in various studies, because frankly, in these studies, people aren't eating mushrooms. They're typically taking synthetic psilocybin, either intravenously, injected into a vein, or orally. And that's how the researchers are able to tightly control the amount of psilocybin. And the typical dosage that's used in clinical studies ranges from 1 milligram, often given repeatedly from day to day over long periods of time, so-called microdosing. And really that 1 milligram per day or even up to 3 milligrams per day repeatedly over time is what people generally think of as microdosing, as compared to, say, a 10 milligram dose given once, maybe twice in 2 separate sessions, or a 25 to 30 milligram dosage that's given once or twice. Now, those amounts of 1 to 3 milligrams or 10 milligrams or 25 to 30 milligrams might not mean much to those of you that don't think about these things in the research terms. Perhaps you've heard of microdosing and you've also heard of macro or quote unquote heroic dosing. Okay. That's sort of common, or I should say popular nomenclature for psychedelics. And I'll circle back to that in a few minutes. But I think one of the questions that I hear a lot is how much psilocybin is present in a given amount of mushrooms. And so the way this typically works is that mushrooms are often discussed in terms of grams or ounces. So an eighth of mushrooms refers to an eighth of an ounce of mushrooms, or X number of grams of mushrooms. The breakdown is actually quite simple. 1,000 milligrams equals 1 gram. And the concentration of psilocybin in most so-called magic mushrooms is about 1%. So 1 gram of mushrooms, being 1,000 milligrams, means that it contains approximately, and again, it's approximately 10 milligrams of psilocybin. And in most of the clinical studies, it's been shown that the dosage of 25 to 30 milligrams given, or I should say taken once or twice, we'll talk about the spacing of sessions a little bit later, taken once or twice is what's leading to the most pronounced therapeutic outcomes. But of course, with enhanced therapeutic outcomes, one also observes enhanced side effect profiles, or what are called adverse events. So there's an important nuanced conversation that has to take place. But right now we're talking about the conversion of grams of mushrooms to psilocybin. So 1 gram of mushrooms being 1,000 milligrams containing 1% psilocybin means that it contains 10 milligrams of psilocybin. Now, the so-called heroic doses that you've heard about, and this is something that's discussed more with the, let's call them traditional or classic psychonauts. These are people that may have an advanced degree, but typically are not running laboratories exploring the effects of psilocybin in controlled clinical trials. These are people who have been longtime explorers and often writers and people who have been spokespeople for psilocybin and other psychedelics. And they will often refer to the so-called heroic doses. It's a little bit hard to translate from that informal community to the scientific data. But in discussing that topic with various researchers who run laboratories at major universities focused on psychedelic therapies, what I was told is that the quote unquote heroic dose that's often discussed really refers to a 5 gram or so dose of mushrooms. So what that translates to is 50 milligrams of psilocybin. So when you hear someone talk about a quote unquote heroic dose, they're probably referring to ingestion of 50 milligrams or so of psilocybin, but in its mushroom form. So about 5 grams of mushrooms. And again, it's important to point out that the concentration of psilocybin in different strains of mushrooms and in different batches, and depending on the age of those mushrooms and how they've been stored, et cetera, can vary tremendously from batch to batch. In fact, there are some laboratories that have explored the range of psilocybin concentration in different mushroom strains. and different so-called magic mushrooms. And that range is pretty broad. It's anywhere from a 0.5% all the way up to 2%. What that means is that someone might get a hold of 1 gram of mushrooms thinking that they're taking 10 milligrams of psilocybin in those mushrooms, when in fact they're actually taking 20. Or somebody could take 3 grams of mushrooms thinking they're taking 30 grams of psilocybin, and in fact they're only taking 10 or 15 milligrams of psilocybin. So the sourcing is really key. Obviously, as things become more legal and more regulated and more used in the therapeutic setting, and this is what's happening more and more, or as people start to rely on synthetically made psilocybin as opposed to using mushrooms to ingest psilocybin, then certainly the dosaging is going to be more consistent from batch to batch, because we're not talking about batches of mushrooms, we're talking about batches of psilocybin itself.